Russia's Victory Day parade has escaped unscathed from Ukrainian drone attacks as President Putin was joined by China's Xi Jinping and 26 world leaders for the military extravaganza in Moscow's Red Square. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey, I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting today with events in Moscow, where Russia has hosted its annual May 9th Victory Day parade to commemorate the end of World War II. The rest of Europe, the rest of the Allies mark this as VE Day on May 8th. Russia calls it Victory Day, marks it on May 9th. And this year, really significant for two reasons. Most importantly, this is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. It is likely to be the last big anniversary where there are still a handful of veterans who fought in that conflict alive. And it is also significant, of course, because it is now the fourth Victory Day parade that's taken place since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And what has changed? Well, a couple of things. This year, significantly, the largest number of international leaders. In the months immediately after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, President Putin was on his own. He was isolated. And we've seen that number creeping up year on year. This year, 27 leaders from countries around the world. By far, the most important guest, who was sitting right next to President Putin, is China's Xi Jinping. But let's look at some of the other ones who were there as well. We had leaders from Brazil, Belarus, Cuba, Egypt, Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau, Serbia, Slovakia, Vietnam, and Venezuela. President Xi was wearing the orange and black ribbon of St. George, like President Putin, a really sort of symbolic show of solidarity. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder. China is showing the world that they are with Russia. They also had some 100 Chinese troops marching in that parade. It's worth noting a couple of leaders did cancel at the last minute, and perhaps we can read into that their loyalties are split, or perhaps they did not want to side with Russia. That was Laos President Sisolith, Azerbaijani President Aliyev. Laos president said he had COVID. Azerbaijan's president said he had domestic commitments. But actually, what we did see from Laos is they also sent soldiers to take part in the parade, as did Azerbaijan, as did a number of other countries. There wasn't a direct overlap, but a number of other countries, including a lot of former Soviet states. The Stans had soldiers taking part in that parade. Now, that is perhaps partly because those soldiers, those countries' soldiers, also took part in World War II. And it's worth remembering the Soviet Union was an ally of the United Kingdom and of the United States during World War II against the Nazis, and the Soviet Union paid by far the highest price in lives. And it's a reminder how much the world has moved on and how the geopolitical alliances have fractured and changed, that now Russia is very much the arch enemy of clearly Ukraine and Ukraine's allies and most of the countries in NATO. We saw the normal things at that Victory Day parade. We saw the T-34 tanks, which gained such a legendary status for the role they played in World War II. Russia could just churn them out. So many of them, not particularly sophisticated, but they just had so many of them that they proved invaluable on the battlefield just in terms of volume. We're seeing a little bit of that industrial might playing out again today. The importance of mass, the ability to mass produce weapons over having a quality all of its own rather than necessarily having exquisite or sophisticated weapons. And clearly one of Russia's great resources in this conflict in Ukraine continues to be mass. We saw everything in the parade that we might expect to see, including the Yars intercontinental ballistic missile carriers. These are the enormous lorries with the nuclear-capable missiles on their backs. We didn't see, as far as I know, any Oreshnik missiles. Now, those are the intermediate range ballistic missiles. that Russia used in this conflict in Ukraine, stunning the world, shocking Ukraine when they fired one of those at Dnipro. Felt like that was a significant escalation. We didn't see any today as far as I was aware. And there was also for the first time a parade of vehicles carrying drones. These are the drones that all hands, for examples, that have been so important in the war in Ukraine. So a recognition of the past, a recognition of what's happening now in Ukraine. And this messaging from Moscow and from those other countries that have chosen to be there, that at best their loyalties are divided, but perhaps I would suggest far more clearly their loyalties are with Russia. And that is clearly going to be something of concern to Ukraine and concern to Ukraine's backers. Nonetheless, Ukraine is also getting similar displays of solidarity from its allies. President Zelensky has said today that he is preparing to host the leaders of the coalition of the willing. Now that is Britain and France, so we should expect Macron and Keir Starmer to be in Kyiv imminently. Downing Street has not confirmed that. They rarely do for security purposes. One thing I'll just touch on, Putin always gives a speech at these parades. He used this one to repeat the normal kind of talking points we'd expect for him. Russia is a bastion against Nazism. Of course, that was what Russia was fighting in World War II. It is not what Russia is fighting now in Ukraine, but that is the lie that Putin perpetuates. And he said that Russia will continue to stand against Russophobia and anti-Semitism. But it's this binding Russian myth that it's sort of Russia against the world or Russia against its haters. He claimed, as all leaders in wars do, that truth and justice is on Russia's side. So if that's the case, let's look at the ceasefires that Russia has refused to accept. Ukraine and President Trump have repeatedly called, and just Trump in a message on Truth Social last night, calling for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire in the air, on the ground and at sea. Russia continuing to reject it. Russia had instead offered a unilateral 3-day ceasefire to cover this window of the Victory Day parades. Ukraine has said that for 2 days now they have not faced attacks from Shahed kamikaze drones, those the Iranian drones which Russia has used so many of in such large volume to overwhelm, saturate Ukraine's air defences and destroy a number of precious, valuable targets, particularly to damage energy infrastructure. So none of those for 2 days, but Ukraine says they've continued to see hundreds of attacks. Particularly, we heard today of attacks in the Sumy region, where Russia's been launching yesterday 130 FAB-guided aerial bombs. Today, the 9th of May, 56. Fighting continues across the front lines. That promise of a ceasefire, that Russian promise of a ceasefire, very much half-baked, a broken promise. So the truth and justice that Putin talks about, not immediately apparent on the battlefield. I think we should also look at a change of tune that we have heard from America, because, ever since Donald Trump has come in, there's been this kind of dizzying geopolitical shift where Washington appeared to be very closely aligned with Moscow. Indeed, Moscow, Putin spokesman Peskov, you'll remember, saying that they were aligned. Russian and US foreign policy goals appeared to be aligned. We've seen a change. J.D. Vance, US Vice President, said that Russia is asking for too much. Now, he put that down as to a sort of normal negotiating strategy. Both sides will ask for more than they will finally settle for. The point he was making was that Russia cannot expect to get land in the negotiations, which it has not yet conquered. The change of tone will be welcomed. The fact that the Americans are calling out the excesses of Russian demands will be welcome in Kyiv, but the fact that J.D. Vance is not pressuring Russia to give up territory that it's captured will, of course, be of concern. Vance's message again was that if they think Russia is negotiating in bad faith, then they will walk away. America keeps repeating this threat now, that they might walk away from this process. Not clear what exactly that would mean, whether they'd walk away from the peace but continue to support Ukraine, especially now they have a vested interest, some sort of vested interest in Ukraine from the minerals deal that Ukraine and America have signed. Another sign of that change of tone before we move on is the US Treasury Secretary said he agreed that President Putin was a war criminal. We haven't heard Trump use that sort of language. Scott Bessent said he thought Putin was a war criminal, but that you have to deal with war criminals. So that is both a recognition of who America thinks it's dealing with, perhaps, but also a sort of realpolitik recognition as well, that you have to deal with these people if you want to make peace. And the American position now is they want to bring Ukraine and Russia into face-to-face talks. That hasn't happened yet. The last thing I'm going to mention today before we get on to questions is the fact that 40 world leaders have backed calls for a special tribunal to prosecute Russian war crimes. This will be the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The suggestion is this would be like a Nuremberg court, the court that tried Nazi leaders for the atrocities of World War II, and again also like courts which tried war criminals after the conflicts in Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda. A reminder that for those 27 world leaders who've turned up in Moscow, there are 40 world leaders who are firmly behind Ukraine and want to see Russians brought to justice. As ever, if you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time, either on the next show or in the comments. The first question I'm actually going to answer goes back to where we started, which is the fact that this victory parade escaped unscathed from Ukrainian attacks. Why didn't Ukraine attack it? Well, the short answer is we don't know. We can speculate. Having President Xi Jinping and those world leaders at Putin's side was a form of air defense. Ukraine does not want to start a conflict with China or indeed any of those other countries who are tentatively or enthusiastically supporting Russia. So it may well have been a deliberate strategic decision not to attack Moscow today. There had been 3 consecutive nights where Ukraine had launched hundreds of drones, 500 we understand according to the Russians, in one 24-hour window, which had repeatedly closed Moscow's main airport. So that was a show of intent, a show of capability. We know that it disrupted the travel plans of some of the leaders who were attending Moscow, and that would suggest they could have done it if they'd wanted to. We don't know. Moscow might have been storing up or amplifying its air defences for today, for May 9th. That's also very likely. But it didn't happen. The parade has continued. Second question, also on the parade. If Russian troops are there, if Xi Jinping is there, does that mean there is a new alliance between China and Russia? Short answer, no. Immediately before the war, President Xi and President Putin agreed a friendship with no limits. And then actually what we saw is the minute Russia declared war on Ukraine, we started to see some of the limits on that friendship because China did not answer the call for help that Putin put out. Putin wanted arms and ammunition immediately, and what we saw actually from China was an unwillingness to do that. They didn't want to get hit with the same sorts of sanctions, international sanctions, that Russia was hit with, but what they did continue to do was provide that sort of dual-use technology, parts which Russia needs to manufacture its weapons. China has without doubt been a supporter of Russia. Most of the ammunition, though, that Russia's getting at the moment is coming from North Korea. Final question today is, what would Donald Trump do if US miners, mining companies, civilians who would have these rights to Ukraine's minerals under this deal, went into Ukraine and were then bombed by Russia? It's a really good question. And fundamentally, I cannot give you a categorical answer. I mean, partly because Donald Trump is so mercurial and unpredictable, but that is a very real risk, a very real scenario. I think it's almost certain that if and when there is a ceasefire, we are likely to see violations, and not just violations, but deliberate provocations. And the nature of provocations, as we've seen since 2014, is they are often calibrated at a level to cause pain, but also confusion, and not to be so egregious, so blatant, that they demand a sort of kinetic military reprisal. And that's the nature of Russia's kind of grey zone fighting, if you like, that sort of provocation, that sort of ratcheting up, but also trying to keep its enemies off balance. And were American miners to be killed, for example, by a Russian missile. I think the first thing you'd expect to see is Russia blaming the Ukrainians for it, trying to sow confusion, trying to suggest that it was a false flag, all these sorts of things. And so how Trump would respond would be really unclear. But what we also know is that there were American companies operating in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion, and many of those operations have fundamentally been suspended because it's not safe for those people to operate in those places where they were working. Thank you very much for your questions. If you've got any, please do answer them in the comments below. Remember, you can now join Frontline. You get early access to members' content. You'll also get badges and exclusive use of emojis. They're really helpful to us if you are asking questions, because it helps us spot your comments. It kind of prioritizes your questions among the many, many thousands. And thank you for all of the comments. We do try and read them all. Look forward to seeing you next time. In a Ukrainian armoured vehicle, and we're heading towards the Russian border.